If you've ever walked away from a conversation and only then realized what you actually thought about it, you already know the gap, the space between when something happens and when your understanding of it finally arrives. Most people assume that if you can't answer immediately, you don't have an answer. That hesitation means uncertainty. It doesn't. The thinking is happening. It's just not finished yet. And the conclusions that arrive on the other side of that gap are almost always more accurate than anything produced on the spot. There's a very specific experience that people in this category share. Something happens, a difficult conversation, a piece of news, a decision that needs to be made, even something good, something exciting, and in the moment you feel a kind of blankness. Not numbness exactly, more like the information has arrived, but the meaning hasn't caught up yet. You're present, you're functioning, but the full weight of what just happened is somewhere behind you, still making its way in. The people around you seem to have reactions in real time. They cry at the news or laugh at the joke or know immediately whether they want the thing being offered. And you're standing there, saying the right things, responding appropriately. And somewhere underneath all of it, there's a quiet awareness that you don't actually know what you think yet. The thinking hasn't happened. It will, but not here, not now. Not in front of anyone. You've probably been in a moment where someone asked for your opinion or your decision, and something in you wanted to say, "Let me think about that." Not to stall, but because it was true. The answer wasn't there yet, and the pressure to produce one before it had formed left you offering something that was plausible but not quite right. What comes later, hours later, the next morning, sometimes days down the road, is when the real reaction arrives, when you finally know how you feel. When the thoughts you didn't have in the moment show up fully formed, as if they were being assembled somewhere just out of reach the whole time. Psychologists who study how the brain makes sense of experiences have noticed something important about this. Emotional and cognitive processing don't always happen at the same speed. For some people, there's a significant gap between when an experience enters their awareness and when their understanding of it becomes available to them. The brain is doing real work during that gap, sorting, integrating, comparing the new experience against everything previously known, but that work happens below the level of conscious access. You can't observe it happening. You can only notice when it's done. Suddenly you know something you didn't know before. This is meaningfully different from suppression. Suppression is when someone pushes an experience away because it's uncomfortable. What's happening here is closer to incubation. The experience is being held, turned over, slowly made sense of in a process that simply can't be rushed. Trying to force a conclusion before this process finishes doesn't produce a better answer faster. It produces a worse answer sooner. And most people who experience this have discovered it through trial and error. They've made a decision before they were ready and regretted it. They've given an answer in the moment that didn't reflect what they actually thought. They've learned, sometimes the hard way, that their real response to things is worth waiting for. This shows up in some very ordinary moments that don't always get named clearly. You've probably been in an argument where you couldn't find the words in the moment, where the other person seemed to have everything ready to say and you were somewhere behind yourself, not quite able to reach what you needed. And then, an hour later or the next day, the whole thing became clear. You knew exactly what you wanted to say. You knew what was true. It arrived completely. Just too late to matter in the original conversation. That experience has a name. Researchers who study how people handle conflict have noticed that some individuals process interpersonal events significantly more slowly than others. Not because they care less, but because their emotional integration takes longer. The people who come back to a conversation after the fact with "what I actually meant was" aren't being passive-aggressive. They're finally at the point where they have access to what was true for them. They just didn't have it when it would have been useful. Or maybe you recognize this in decisions. The way that being asked to choose something quickly produces a kind of blankness, a genuine inability to access your own preference on demand, while the same decision left alone overnight becomes obvious, as if some part of you was working on it the whole time and simply needed the noise to stop before it could deliver the answer. There's a particular way this pattern shapes relationships, and it's worth sitting with because it's the source of both its cost and its value. People who process slowly are often the most thoughtful people in any relationship. They're the ones who come back to things, who circle around to something that happened 3 weeks ago because they finally finished understanding it and they want to say so, who send the message at an unexpected moment because something just clicked, who apologize more thoroughly than most people, not quickly, in the heat of regret, but later when they've fully grasped what happened and what it meant. For the people on the receiving end of this kind of relationship, it can be disorienting at first. There's an expectation in most social environments that reactions happen in real time. That presence means immediate response, that if someone didn't react strongly in the moment, the thing didn't land or didn't matter, and people who process this way often appear from the outside to be less affected than they are. Calmer, more detached. Fine. They're not fine, usually, they're still in the gap. The reaction is coming. It's just not available yet. Where this pattern comes from varies, but a thread shows up consistently. People who need time to process often grew up in environments where the pace of their interior life was mismatched with what was expected of them, where being slow to respond was read as not having anything to say, where decisions were pressed for before the deciding was actually done, where the natural rhythm of their processing was, in some subtle and repeated way, treated as a problem. Some people in this situation learn to produce faster answers, not because they'd actually finished processing, but because the social cost of the pause was too high. They learned to perform readiness they didn't feel, to say something plausible while the real answer was still assembling itself somewhere underneath. And over time, that performance became habitual, which meant they were always slightly ahead of where they actually were, always a little out of sync with their own interior, always giving answers that were good enough, but not quite true. Recognizing that pattern and deciding to stop performing readiness is often one of the more significant shifts someone in this category makes. Not all at once. Gradually, learning to say, I need some time with that and meaning it and letting the real answer come when it's actually ready. There's something worth saying directly about what slow processing actually produces, because the cultural script gets it backwards. The conversation about fast and slow thinking usually frames slow as a deficit. The person who needs time to think is the person who's behind. The person who answers immediately is the one who knows what they're doing. That's the assumption embedded in almost every interview, every meeting, every social situation that asks people to perform readiness on demand. What that script misses is what slow processing is actually doing. The conclusions that arrive after genuine incubation aren't slower versions of fast conclusions. They're qualitatively different. They've been through more. They've had time to find the right shape. They're informed by things that fast processing doesn't have time to include. Subtle feelings, competing considerations, the memory of similar things that happened before, the quiet sense of what matters beneath the obvious answer. And here's the part that recalibrates the whole conversation. People who process slowly aren't producing the same answer in more time. They're producing a different kind of answer entirely, or the kind that holds up under examination, the kind that doesn't need to be revised 3 days later, the kind that takes the long view because the long view is the only way the mind producing it can operate. The people around them who need fast answers will sometimes be impatient with this. That's a real cost. But the cost of mistaking slow processing for absence of thought is much higher, because the answer that comes out of it is almost always the one worth waiting for. People who process this way often have an unusual relationship with certainty. They're rarely confident too early. They tend not to commit to things before they've finished understanding them. From the outside, this can look like hesitation, reluctance, difficulty deciding, unwillingness to commit. What it actually is respect for the process. An understanding built through experience that the first available answer is not always the right one, and that waiting for the right one is worth the discomfort of not having it yet. In environments that slow down enough to accommodate this, in work that rewards careful thought, in relationships where patience is genuine, in decisions where the timeline is long enough to matter, people who process this way are often the most reliable source of the answer that holds up. Not the first answer, the right one. So the next time you find yourself in that gap, present in the room, functioning in the conversation, but aware that the real processing hasn't happened yet, it doesn't mean something is wrong. It doesn't mean you're disconnected from your feelings or behind in some way that needs fixing. It means your mind is wired for depth of integration, for conclusions that have been somewhere before they come out, for a kind of knowing that can't be rushed because it's doing something that speed would interrupt. The gap isn't absence, it's the place where the real understanding is being built. And the answer that comes out of it when it finally arrives is almost always worth what it took to wait. So now I'm curious. Are you someone who needs time to process, who tends to know what you think after the moment, not inside it? Or are you the opposite, someone whose reactions arrive in real time, who feels things immediately and knows right away where they stand? Tell me where you land.